welcome once again to the second or first session, in fact, of this workshop. It's not important at the academic level, but in this part of the world which goes from one upheaval to another, which engulfs almost the entire region. This theme unfortunately was one of the reasons why a number of Arab revolutions have ended up in failure, especially when they managed to change the system at the top, but they have failed in the process of transformation and the democratic process or democratization once the armed activism phase was over. In the science or the field discipline of dispute settlement, this aspect, like transformation in the areas of conflict, has not, unfortunately, gained a lot of interest. In post-World War II, when studies were conducted, it was found that 70% of conflicts or armed activism which ended up in a peaceful process continued having problems because of the problems emanating from including ex-combatants to the regular armed forces. In the example of Libya, for example, also a main reason for instability was the failure in integrating these ex-combatants. Where I did some research into the Libyan case. The number of fighters after the collapse of the Gaddafi regime, there were an estimated 200,000 fighters. When the reintegration process started, the first year, the number of fighters joining the process were only 5,000 out of 200,000. This is indicative of the problems encountered in this regard. We're talking about the Libyan cause. Of course, I don't want to say a lot because we have Abdul Hakim with us. He is the expert. I'll leave it to him to tell you about it. Today we will discuss three cases. We have three distinguished scholars in this regard. We will hear from them. First, we will start with Dr. Khalil Anani. He is the head of the political science department here in our Doha Institute. Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim, and our thanks go to the Arab Center and our colleague Dr. Umar Ashur. I only arrived 4 hours ago to the airport, so please forgive my voice. Today I will be talking about the transformation of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, the debate on the relationship between repression and violence and revisions. I have three main observations. The idea of armed activism is not something new. Violence has been part and parcel of human behavior, not only at the political level, of course. Also, studying this at the academic level in the last maybe 5 years, we had very important academic works in using the sacred text, for example, in justifying violence. Also, armed activism is not confined to a certain geographical location, but it's in the context in which the relations between different political actors who resort either armed or unarmed activism. This kind of context can lead into one of two trajectories, either for example, resorting to violence. We have many examples of this, or the other thing, and that is the other side of the equation, moving from armed activism to unarmed activism. Maybe the most vivid example was the case of Algeria after the 2005 agreement, and also in Egypt when some Islamic groups like Jama'ah Islamiyya, the famous revision of their ideological stance. So therefore, the main point that we as researchers should take into consideration is not why groups and organizations resort to armed activism, but what are the processes which push these organizations, and what are the underlying factors which determine that which path they choose, whether armed or unarmed, and therefore this should be where we should focus our debate. And also the relationship here we're talking about is a linear, mechanical relationship, and it's not by necessity that every time we include armed groups, this will lead to them giving up armed activism or vice versa. Now we move to the Islamic groups and violence. This is a very complicated and confused relationship when text is confused with context, and there are different interpretations as to why a religious group would resort to violence. But according to our experience, we can distinguish between two different patterns. The first pattern is what's called the theological or religious violence, which emanates from a religious background, and the groups who practice this in practice what is called sacred violence, which interprets the religious text or Sharia. We have different groups. We start, for example, with the excommunication and flight, Takfir wal-Hijra, and also Jama'ah al-Islamiyya, which when was first formed was not violent, but they moved from using unarmed activism to armed activism. Dr. Azmi covered what I'm going to talk about next, and that is the political violence which is practiced by religious and non-religious groups to achieve either liberation from occupation, like what Hamas does. They use weapons as a main tool for resistance, so we cannot call them a violent group. They are a resistance group. Or, for example, Jama'ah al-Islamiyya, which started also with the aim of establishing an Islamic State, and also the different groups which appeared in Egypt after 2013 to achieve political aims and not necessarily religious. So far as the Muslim Brotherhoods are concerned, since they were stripped of their power, deposed in 2013, very deep questions have been raised as to what extent do the Muslim Brotherhood believe in violence, and is it a sacred theological violence or is it a political violence, and why has some groups engaged in violence against the political system? How can we explain this transformation? Has the group completely given up on the peaceful activism or unarmed activism? All these questions and others have been floated since they were deposed in 2013. If we go to the past, we will see that the Muslim Brotherhood started as a peaceful group calling for da'wah or propagation of the message of Islam. Political activism even was not there from 1928 when they were established until 1930 or 35. The political aspect was not there until the fifth conference in 1938 was held, and then indications started appearing for the political activism. One of the statements attributed to Hassan al-Banna speaks of that. Hassan al-Banna says in one of his messages that many people wonder or ask whether the Muslim Brotherhood can use violence to achieve their purposes, or are they thinking of setting off a revolution. I do not want to leave them without certainty. I want to give them a clear answer. As for force or as present in our religious text, the Holy Quran says, "Prepare yourselves and arm yourselves with the means of power." And the Prophet says, "A strong believer is better than a weak believer." And what is required of us is to delve deeply into this. The first aspect of power is the power of belief, then the power of organization, and thirdly, the power or the strength emanating from arms. And we should take into consideration all these aspects. If we use arms when we're disintegrated in a disarray and without strong beliefs, we doom ourselves into oblivion and total failure. So this indicates that Hassan al-Banna talks about three stages in preparation for power. First of all, the Muslim Brotherhood would use arms when there is no other means available, and when they use arms, they will be clear and noble. They will see first, they will wait, then in a manner which is dignified and strong, resort to using what they're going to use. So therefore there is this gives the impression that there is a principled stance in favor of using violence, although we can discuss that. The paper discusses three main ideas. First of all, using violence in response to the oppression by the system in authority, and the violence which can be within the Islamic groups. The first proposition here is that responding to a regime's oppression is one out of other choices, and this can be resorted to by religious and other groups. It's a tool, it's considered to be a tool which is resorted to in response to oppression, and oppression which comes from an authoritarian regime which does not allow for any political activism. So it is one choice out of many. The second aspect, which is very important and we must distinguish and separate between individually practiced violence and the group practiced violence. Which in second case is called the collective actor as a result of a strategic policy or decision by an entire group. Also, there is sometimes another aspect, and that is there are factors which mean that moving from a state of feeling frustrated into using violence rather spontaneously, not in an organized or premeditated manner. The Muslim Brotherhoods, especially after June 2013, for example, we can understand this through understanding the memory aspect when there is severe oppression, especially what happened in Rab'a and Nahda squares. So maybe the memory is stuck in the minds of some members of the Muslim Brotherhood can lead them to violence. Also, the grievances or human emotions which are the result of feeling disappointed, or the political trauma which also can make some individuals resort to violence. So therefore, we must if we want to understand this, we must deconstruct these factors to see why these people use violence or justify it at least. Here there is a methodology I use, first of all, to analyze the statement by the Muslim Brotherhood since the days of Hassan al-Banna as to why the group can use violence as a political tool. Secondly, to interviews made by some leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood. Last year, I conducted 24 interviews with former and current leaders of the Brotherhood. Some are still inside Egypt, some moved to London or Istanbul in Turkey. The Brotherhood's stance until now have a somewhat confused position until the 80s. In the 40s, when they established the so-called special organization, or special branch of the organization, when Hassan al-Banna decided to establish that branch, so there was a linkage here between political activism and preparing for violence. But al-Banna, just before his death, or a few months before his death, he sort of denounced this special organization, and after the assassination of the Ahmed Khazandar, he wrote an article saying these are neither brothers nor Muslims, basically. So this gives the indication that he regretted the establishment of this armed group or special branch or special organization. When the Muslim Brotherhood asked about this, they said this was not a religious organization. It was just that was established to resist against the British occupation or the Israeli occupation, and some facts on the ground support this when they joined the 1948 war. This confused narrative continued till the 50s and 60s, and until Saeed Qutb contextualized that in his writings, and when he started talking about ignorance, al-Jahiliyyah, Hakimiyya, governance of God, and other aspects of the articles of faith, when the vanguard movement, which can bring back societies into the days of belief and take them out of the days of ignorance, and also the famous booklet that we are propagators, not judges of others, by Ma'mun al-Hudaybi. And gradually they gave up on the violence as a tool for change. And when Sadat came and he brought them out of prisons after they languished there for years, they went back to their peaceful propagation of the message of Islam. And also they were engaged in formal politics in the 70s and 80s in elections, although some of their leaders secretly kept to the principle of believing in the use of violence. And this is what Abdul Manan Abu al-Futuh wrote about, and said some of their leaders remained faithful to that principle right to the 80s. And in 2010, he wrote about himself when he was a leader in the 70s of the Muslim Brotherhood. He said, we used to believe in violence and the necessity of violence. Violence was for us both justified and legitimate, and we were not going to use it then, but preparing ourselves to use it later on. But the difference between us and those who practiced violence, like the Islamic Jihad and others, they rushed into the decision before the conditions were ripe. And he says that some leaders until 1984 were still believing in violence until the general elections. From the 1980s to 2010, although the Muslim Brotherhood was not a recognized political group in Egypt, but they were the biggest political group in the country nonetheless. This is rather ironic. And they took part in the elections in different times, and they completely gave up on the question of violence. After 2013 coup, the situation has changed. The regime has started uprooting them and liquidating them completely in an unprecedented manner, and they put policies specifically aimed at uprooting them. And it was thought that it would be natural that this kind of oppressive environment would lead to violence. It must be said that the first incident when violence occurred amongst the Muslim Brothers came after the Rabi'a massacre in 2013-2014. At that time, according to the statements of some, there was a debate between the leadership and the rank and file of the organization when there were demonstrations against the massacres. Some of the young members asked the leadership that if you ask us to go out on demonstrations, at least you should provide us with the means to defend ourselves. But the leadership was very decisive that no way we can use violence. Anybody who uses violence will be excommunicated, will be thrown out of the organization. But the main transformation changed when the Muslim Brotherhood was declared a terrorist organization in 2013. At that time, the idea of accepting violence has become more accepted amongst the young members, and there was division at the level of the leadership and the rank and file. And this was one of the strategies employed by the regime to push the organization towards violence. And some of the young members said, we are dead anyway, they're going to kill us anyway, we might as well use violence to defend ourselves. And they Some networks were started, some cells, we cannot call them groups, started using violence not for religious purposes but for political purposes as a response to the regime's oppressive policies. And the main difference is what's called some networks which appeared, which were formed as a result of directives from some leaders of the group, and also there was divisions amongst the group itself. There was the so-called the High Administrative Committee, which was inside Egypt. This committee is accused by some people to use they use violence, they legitimized it, and they used some sort of qualitative violence, as some describe it. They used it. They used violence towards the security apparatus and not to direct it towards individuals. Only those who are accused of spilling blood, then justice would be exacted from them, like members of the police or others who killed innocent people. Was the leadership aware of this? Who supported it? Who financed it? Who directed it? Especially after the assassination or liquidation of Dr. Muhammad Kamal, who was thought to have contextualized this approach, and he was leading it. And also the appearance of a group called Hasm, which is thought to be a splinter group from the Muslim Brotherhood. Now I can move to another aspect. Most of the testimonies I have learned about through interviews, which says that some are started thinking that violence is inevitable, there is no other way to respond, we are being annihilated. Like somebody told me that his own brother died in his arms in Rabaa. He said, if I had access to a weapon, he would definitely use it. So these are individuals driven by revenge. One of the individuals I met, he's outside Egypt now, said one of the historical mistake by the Muslim Brotherhood is the disbandment of the special group in the 1940s. Also, as we said, now the discourse of exacting revenge now is dominating the thinking of some people. Some even left Egypt and joined ISIS. They are very few in number, although. First of all, the Muslim Brotherhood had somewhat a confused discourse regarding the use of violence until the 1980s. Some were preparing for it for political reasons, only to be used later on. And in the 90s and until the revolution, there is a close relationship between political oppression and the practice of violence. The group, it's very clear that it's not a causation or a causal relationship, but there is, wherever there is oppression, there is calls for violence. Wherever there is political openness, this subsides. And also we must distinguish between the individual traits and the organizational approach. By and large, the Muslim Brotherhood as an organization are still a peaceful organization. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Khalil, for this valuable presentation. Now we go to Iraq with Dr. Haider Saeed, who is a researcher in the Arab Center for he will speaking about Jaysh al-Mahdi, the Mahdi army. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Assalamu alaikum, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd like to extend my thanks to Mr. Omar Ashur for inviting us and to make it for to participate in this important conference. My paper is under the title Jaysh al-Mahdi as a post-political party phenomena. Maybe this is a study for the Sadri movement more than the Jaysh al-Mahdi, the al-Tayar al-Sadri and its relationship with, if we can call it, its armed branch. In fact, the main points in this paper even goes along with the theoretical aspects of the paper. I worked on the literature about the changes and transformations in political parties and more than the studies that study armed groups and their changes. What I found as useful is only to speak shortly about the history of them. These changes in the political framework, at least in Iraq and within the main ideological parties, the Ba'ath Party and the Communist Party, and their experiences with the armed branches. Al-Ba'ath Party has an important political armed branch called al-Haras al-Qawmi, and the communists have al-Qawm al-Sha'biyya. And we must also here I'm speaking about the political parties in Iraq. These armed branches were the means used by the political parties to get to power, and that's why the most important thing for these parties was to have formations and organization inside the military and the army in order to be able to come to power. The Ba'ath Party succeeded that because they created a military office or bureau, and that helped them to come to power both in Iraq and in Syria. Many people qualified al-Mahdi army as militias, whereas I think it's more complicated than that because, or maybe this is on the basis of it's being called Jaysh army. But if you see the beginnings of the creation of this, we find it was created even before al-Sadri movement, and it is different from the models used by other political parties. It was not created as an armed branch for a party. No, it was only created by a number of scholars, religious scholars in Najaf, and they said in their manifesto that which was read by Mr. Al-Sadr in 2003, he can say that until the announcement of the creation of Jaysh al-Mahdi, one could not speak about a political formation that was part of al-Sadri's. But nevertheless, the birth of this army was a political one, and which led to the creation of al-Sadri movement. And so, when the announcement of the creation of Jaysh al-Mahdi, it had an army waiting for orders. It did not include combating the American occupation of Iraq. And then the Jaysh al-Mahdi was given a number of functions that it can undertake or might want to undertake or might have to undertake. And here I must say that that the absence of societal organizations in Iraq gave this big role to religious organizations, and then we can also discuss in this context the concept of the rogue state or failed state, and that the creation of Jaysh al-Mahdi was to compensate for a number of functions that the state should have undertaken, because it was a militia, and here we're talking about protecting the security of regions, and the political organization and a service institution. It began in the 90s in the movement created by Muhammad Sadr, the father, which was different from the others, and so the Sadris after 2003 could have developed the way that the father could have developed, and that was not possible for 2003. That's why it was created with the creation of political movements. And if the Sadri movement goes back to the 90s, Jaysh al-Mahdi was created in 2003, and it is that it complemented the movement, and hence the relation between Jaysh al-Mahdi and the movement of Sadri was not like an ideological relation like in other political parties, and it wasn't just an armed group that developed to become a political party. No, both grew up together. One of the most important factors that explains the strength of Jaysh al-Mahdi is the political religious network created by Muhammad al-Sadr, the father, which was enhanced by a network of deputies who in the different areas of the influence of Sadris. These zones cannot be defined on sectarian basis, just like the Shi'is, because the Shi'i zones or areas were also under competition with other different Shiite movements, and we cannot say that al-Sadri movement is either from the south or the south of Euphrates. No. So it's not only expression of the Shiites of the south, but although the father had opened the way for that, so the Sadri movement represented the Shias of the suburbs of the big cities, especially Baghdad and Basra, were the biggest suburbs in both Basra and Baghdad. And al-Sadri movement always enjoyed this paradox that the elements are from these suburbs and the leaders are from the holy city of Najaf and Karbala. And they began to be active after the American occupation of Iraq. And Mr. Muqtada al-Sadr quickly succeeded in reviving the old network that his father had built, I will go over some. So the Pandora box of Shi'is as Muqtada al-Sadr, who is very rise after weeks after the disappearance of Saddam, led to a lot of vacuum and the differences inside the Shiite community in Iraq, in a way to develop or to put Muhammad Sadr up within the political context of that time, and there was the dichotomy of inside or outside. If most of the Iraqi political elite came from outside, because the Iraqi opposition were from outside, whereas Sadr was the political who grew up and continued to live in Iraq, inside Iraq. So in the 90s, there was also the stress on the societal role of the religious institution, and that's why they speak about the silent Hausa and the speaking Hausa, as compared by the Najaf traditions, which at the time did not play the big role that is played now by Sistani, and as a consequence of the American occupation and Sadr had said that he's opposed that process because it's the result of foreign occupation of this country, and unlike his father, which is the dichotomy of Arabic Iranian. Al-Sadr movement represents a political organization post political parties, and because it's not built on this hierarchy, it is a horizontal organization with the head is Muqtada Sadr, and their adherence and loyalty is represented by some supporters whose numbers are open and they are not organized, and also does not adopt a sort of status or internal status, and that's why when this movement wanted to be changed into a parliamentary bloc, they used some other, and they went into parliament on other names such as al-Ahrar and now Sa'irun. And these are usually parliamentary blocs that do not become political organization. That was Jaysh al-Mahdi was the first organizational institution attached to for the Sadri movement. Some suggest that creation of al-Mahdi army is a result of the creation of the Council of Ruling Iraq, and because it had adopted a different approach that other approaches that rose after the 2003. And this is an expression about an approach that is against the American concept of Iraq post-Saddam Hussein Iraq. In fact, as was the creation of the military organization, was any development in this movement will be decided by the relations with the military organization, and there will be a disproportional relationship between al-Mahdi Jaysh and the dynamism of the movement of Sadr. And in fact, the most important moment in this was the time when the al-Mahdi, Jaysh al-Mahdi, was attacked by the Iraqi army in the battle called Sawlat al-Fusan in 2008, when that rose questions about the movement al-Sadr. And there was always this enigma of the continuation of Jaysh al-Mahdi after the big blow it had in 2008. Nevertheless, these elements of Jaysh al-Mahdi are when they follow and accept the decision of the leadership to dissolve the army. One speaks about the crisis of the Sadri movement. What is this crisis? After George Bush's plan to the surge of the American forces in Iraq to combat ISIS, it was also said that at the same time was confront the Shiite militias that played a big role in the civil war 2007-2008. So the confrontation began with the American forces, and there was this incident of the Council of the Directorate of Karbala, where 8 American soldiers were kidnapped and killed later on, after which Muqtada Sadr announced in August 2007 announced a ceasefire, and then there was this battle of Sawlat al-Fusan. Then on the summer of 2008, he announced the creation of 2 organizations to replace al-Mahdi, one called al-Mufadun, al-Mumuahidun, which were charged with social and cultural activities, and another organization called al-Mujahidun, which is the military branch. But he said this small organization will not work unless by direct orders from Muqtada al-Sadr himself. I'm here discussing some explanations of this strange situation of a military organization that had a big blow, a strong blow. Nevertheless, it was able, this meant that the Tayyar movement of Sadri was able to distribute his capabilities at the time when they were under blockade, and we can't speak really about big societal resources, and then they began creating their system of rental income. I have two explanations. One is the religious legitimacy of the leadership of Tayyar al-Sadr, especially his person, but this by itself is not enough. And here I think we should discuss the roles of the different religious leaders who obtain a sort of secrecy, and the other factor is that how these social networks related to Sadr Tayyar movement, Sadr movement, how are they being run, and how do they coordinate with the branches in different parts of the country? In all cases, regardless of the interpretation, this situation had led to a concept that's become part of the Iraqi politics, that's to say the existence or the presence of the al-Sadr movement is something constant and will not change, and regardless of the number of seats they get in the parliament, which means all the bases and supporters of al-Sadr movement remain loyal to their leadership, and that's why. But that does not mean that there are not some divisions inside the ranks of al-Mahdi army, knowing that the biggest part of al-Mahdi army or Jaysh army remained loyal to Muqtada al-Sadr. In 2007, the American used a new terminology called special groups, referring to the groups that are supported by Iran and attacking the burgeoning state of Iraq, and this expression targeted the fighters of al-Mahdi army who did not abide by the decision of Sadr to stop fighting and continue to fight. It seems here I must jump because I'm short of time. Now I'll be speaking about the movement of Qais al-Khazali, who since 2004 began to have his own status inside al-Mahdi, Jaysh al-Mahdi, until he finally was separated when the freezing of the army was decided in 2008. I tried to hear the divisions or the contradictory ideas inside the movement go back to 2004. And I think here is something important, that the relationship between the al-Mahdi, Jaysh al-Mahdi, and the movement was that there was always a lot of differences between them about the kind of relationship between the two. There was one wing that was with Sadr and other scholars who wanted to stop military action and to change Tayyar al-Sadr into a societal, religious organization, and to say that what was done before was to keep the unity of the movement. The other branch is that they consider al-Sadri movement as an armed resistance movement, that this was led by Qais al-Khazali and led to creation of his own organization. This division is very important inside the movement because here I must dwell on the differences they had in 2005 about the elections, and I think the movement decided to continue to go into the elections. And then the position regarding Iran, I think, is also important. Iran supported the Shiite political organizations and was thinking that it was necessary to have an armed political Shiite group, and that's it. Since 2004 began to support al-Khazali branch. The final paragraph, I would say, since 2008 and 2009 also, appeared dozens of studies about the Sadri movement and al-Mahdi. Most of them by American think tanks about al-Mahdi army, and this was only it was not seen before that. But the most important thing was, for instance, that was the question: how will this movement of al-Mahdi, of al-Sadr, will develop along with Jaysh al-Mahdi, which the American intelligence services had adopted the model of Hezbollah in Lebanon to understand Jaysh al-Mahdi. Here, an American researcher wrote a good paper about that, saying that Sadr after 2003 tried to follow the example of Hezbollah by counting on three things: political, military, and social. But one cannot really think so. But he was pushed to do so. I think Iran pushed him to do so. And then there were some approaches about him, because he has a uniqueness in his Iraqi experience, and every thought that he will develop just like on the model of Hezbollah. But Jaysh al-Mahdi had three constants: that they follow a military political organization, and that they should be seen within the prism of Hezbollah. Another writer said that Sadri movement in 2008 is presumed that the Sadri movement will develop on the model of Hezbollah, and that the elite forces who are highly trained will be the basis to impose political influence. But my last point is that what is constant here, that this Sadri movement developed in the opposite direction, and its political direction grew and developed in a way to weaken the military branch. So that's to say, the militia were isolated for the benefit of the political organization, and did not follow the Hezbollah model. And dividing the al-Mahdi, Jaysh al-Mahdi, into two branches was to weaken the military force. I'm only discussing how that Iraqi Hezbollah is in fact Asab, but not Jaysh al-Mahdi. Maybe you can read all this in details in the book. Thank you for your attentive listening. Thank you, Dr. Haider. In fact, this is a very long topic, and the discussions are continuing. But we only have 20 minutes, so we try to shed light on the most important points. Now we give the floor to our colleague, the researcher in the Arab Center, Mr. Hamzeh Almoustafa. He's coming from long travel and will be with us within the limited time we have. He will be talking about which in my opinion is very important. It's a comparative study of the transformations of the Syrian Islamist movements, Ahrar al-Sham, Jaysh al-Sham, and Faylaq al-Sham. This is a comparative study that will give us an idea about the transformations. You have 20 minutes. Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim, and thank you, Dr. Omar, for inviting us to take part in this important research project. In fact, When we speak about Syria, we usually remember the third chapter of Lisa Wood's book, which was under the title Killing the Politics, showing that how the Syrian regime in 30 years had worked physically and morally by attacking their enemies and killing them, and that's why Syria was an exceptional tyranny, and whether in the Arab world or the Middle East in general. But this does not mean that there was no opposition. No, opposition was there, but within some elite groupings and groups that have limited influence, while as the Islamic movements were completely banned, and in 1981 there was a death sentence for anyone who joined the Islamic movement. So the Syrian revolution was an opportunity for the opposition in general and the Islamists in particular to present their program. When this revolution opened the space that's not controlled by the regime or by the government. So these parties were able to present their programs and get in touch with the society for the first time. To draw the military map of Syria is very difficult because sometimes there are about 250 different military groups, and we can divide them into three groups using about the first group considers violence as a continuation of the peaceful action they had, at least on the discourse level. So the second group includes the Islamic movements, I call them the national and the local, which consider violence as a main tool in addition to other tools that we will refer to later on. And the third part group, those who think that violence is their main and only way of action, and for creation of the Islamic Caliphate. We have examples that Daesh, Nusra, Ansar al-Din, and Islamic Turkestani movement.
In this paper, I will focus on the second type, which includes Islamic movements. I'll take three movements. I've chosen them not because they were active partners, but because they represent three different ideological trends. Ahrar al-Sham considers itself as an extension of the nationalist jihadi Salafi movements, which wants to separate itself from al-Qaeda. Jaysh al-Islam is a very complicated case. It's an extension of the scientific Salafi school in Syria, which is a very limited group or ideology. The Wahhabis are known to have a very negative approach to rebelling against rulers, so they did not find justification of rebelling against the ruler except through the prism of takfir or excommunication. The third group is Faylaq al-Sham, which is probably the most active now in the view of the heavy defeats suffered by many opposition groups. These three factions have gone through deep transformations up and down towards what we call moderation, with our reservation, of course. But one way or another, in the last 7 years, they've gone through, nonetheless, transformations. Ahrar al-Sham in 2011 entered the fray as armed brigades to establish the Islamic State. Then later on, they identified themselves as a group trying to effect political reform in society. And then Ahrar al-Sham ended up being close to and started with closely associated to al-Nusra. Later on, they became part and parcel of the wide opposition against the regime. Also, Jaysh al-Islam, in my estimation, has tried to copy the experience of Hezbollah through the name, through the separating between armed activism and social work, and also even geographically they were located in an area south of Damascus, similar to the southern district in Dahiya Janubiya of Beirut. The Jaysh started with grand and like restoring the glories of the Umayyad dynasty, and then they joined the political fray when they joined the High Commission for Political Negotiations, when they started calling for entering politics, basically. Faylaq al-Sham is a more complicated. And the Faylaq does not see itself through the school of Hassan al-Banna only as a general framework, but they are not linked to the Muslim Brotherhood. I don't think this is necessarily true. Everybody almost in Syria perceives the Faylaq al-Sham as the indirect political arm of the the armed wing, of the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria. All these three movements, as was much talked about lately, they all became part and they joined the National Front for Liberation. This may be a military front, but it has a political program. I just want to pause for a few seconds to allude to the outcomes of these transformations. This is a process still in the making. There are no final outcomes yet. Dr. Umar, in the morning session, more or less determined all the theoretical determinants that I have, or parameters I have used in my paper. Most importantly for me is the charismatic leadership. This was very evident in Ahrar al-Sham and Jaysh al-Sham. Ihsan Aboud was such a leader, charismatic leader. He was able, although he was very strong in his attitude, but he was able to reach out, if not to the entire rank and file, but to the middle ranks at least of any reform attempts or something. And at a time when there was a struggle between the hawks and the doves within Ahrar al-Sham, this struggle led to Ahrar al-Sham not being able to persevere and survive vis-a-vis ISIS and al-Nusra, although it was equal in numbers. The charismatic leadership of Alloush he was going through very rapid transformations, very bold, too, which could not be understood. At one stage, he said that democracy, I tread on democracy with my feet, and we are here to restore the glorious victories of the Umayyad destiny. Then, in his own sort of pragmatism, he started approaching the Americans to get support from them. And 2015, before the killing of Zahran al-Lush, he announced that the Jaysh al-Sham has no qualms with the democratic state coming into existence through a political process. Also, as for the leadership of Ahrar al-Sham, there is some ambiguity surrounding that. Unlike the two other examples, Faylaq al-Sham has its leadership is political in its entirety, and it really dominates it, especially Nazir al-Hakim, who is described as a pragmatist and able to broker deals with the regional powers and the neighboring countries. Faylaq al-Sham did not allow for any military leader to come forward. Or there's Mundir Shlash, but he's not that important compared to Haytham, Rahma, and Nadir al-Hakim. Also, the other aspect is the internal debate. This had a main role to play. In Ahrar al-Sham appeared after 2013, when Ahrar al-Sham transformed themselves from brigades into a movement. They used to be called the Katab al-Fajr, the Dawn Brigade. This was when new blood joined the group. Abu Yazan al-Shami, for example, before he was killed, it was when he said, "I'm not a Salafi, a jihadist Salafist, and I apologize to the entire Islamic nation for all the troubles we caused in the last 2 decades. And what we'll do from now on will only be compatible to the interests of the Syrian people." Of course, he said that, and after that he was killed in the bombing of the so-called Zero headquarters of his movement. There is another aspect which is very important. When the first revision started in the Sadnaya prison, these 3 groups were an extension of the experience of Sadnaya prison. That prison went out of the control of the regime for about 6 months. I interviewed some 25 leaders. 6 or 7 of them were present in this. The prison was divided into 3 levels. The first floor was for the global Salafism, which decided to confront the regime and to declare a Khilafah system, a caliphate system from this prison, and will be spread throughout the country. Then the second movement was led by Hassan Sofan, who considered the regime was considered as a kafir or excommunicated regime, but there was no harm in negotiating with them. And the third party, they took the third floor, and they were represented by the Muslim Brotherhood and the scientific thing. In the end, the other 2 groups lost to the third group, and when they came out of prison, each one of them established his own movement, like Zahran al-Lush and others, Yusuf Islam and others. There are other determinants of this transformation. There are, of course, there is the internal aspect. These movements, although they claim they know the Syrian society, they came into contact with their own societies for the first time. They found themselves forced to provide services, to govern areas, etc. And this led some groups, especially Ahrar al-Sham, to soften their attitude and positions. Of course, there is the element of the neighboring countries. For example, when ISIS appeared in 2013, and after the rise of ISIS, they approached the approach that they were the best and they represent the truth, and no other group could resist them, and many fighters gave up their own groups and joined them. A front was formed under the name of the Islamic Front, which they wanted to determine a position vis-à-vis every question in the world: democracy, ruling elites, jihad, etc. And in that time, there was intervention by the regional powers like Turkey and Qatar. And in this context, we can understand why the revolutionary covenant or charter was announced, which called for a process of democratization, etc. The international context is very important. One of the reasons why Ahrar al-Sham have gone through change, they had this attitude since Sadnaya prison. They wanted to avoid being labeled a terrorist organization. They always wanted to set themselves apart from the jihadi Salafist movements, and they always presented themselves as not this group and not that. For this reason, I call them the post-Salafist jihadist group. And what I'm going to say next will apply to Faylaq al-Sham specifically. And the discord and the divisions they had to endure. There is one group which is headed by Ghufghed, which said that the generational divisions come into existence usually when the leaders or the old guard or the old generation, which came into existence after, we're talking about the Muslim Brotherhood, which came after the Hama massacres. Of course, when we say the young generation for Muslim Brotherhood, we mean the group of people aged 50 onwards. And people like the Nadir al-Hakim and others, and there's all different subgroups they formed. The first opinion says these are the political extension of Muslim Brotherhood and their policies. In my opinion, it combines the two. They really had some leaders, young leaders like Nadir al-Hakim, and I forgot the others. And also, they remained within the general framework of the movement. Like Faylaq Sham, they have not taken any decisions which is apparently different than the general movement. They did not attempt to form any political entity. There was an attempt some time ago that there will be a political banner for the Faylaq Sham, but that never came into existence. So there is a lot of things that really need further research, that most of the revisions were on the level of behavior and organization and were driven by pragmatic divisions or reasons. There was no real ideological revision. And also, we'll see responses to these revisions more than the revisions themselves. I'll leave it here, and we'll leave any questions to the questions and answers. Thank you very much, Hamza. It's worth mentioning that we had an important case which is not Islamist, which is the change of the al-Quwat al-Lebanese, the Lebanese forces, and because Dr. Walid al-Khazin, because he was appointed ambassador to the Vatican, turned down our invitation in the last minute because he could not. So this is part of the transformation that he is going through, it seems. Okay, we will take some questions. Can the questioner use the microphone, please? We cannot hear him. Dr. Yunus Muhammad Danab from the Center for Studies at the Ministry of Defense. My question to Dr. Saeed. Despite the fact that the Mahdi army was established before the Mahdi trend, but it's still in operation, despite the fact that it was frozen. Now they have the so-called al-Salam brigades, which is still armed, which is still operating within the popular mobilization movement. Also, there is a very distinct contradiction in the Sadri's trend. Once they were with the resistance against the Americans, once they were with the Americans against Iran, once with Iran against the Americans. All these positions, even the political positions in parliament, are contradictory. Despite the fact that they have a very wide popular support base in the Shiite community, but the damage caused by them 2007, 2008 will not be forgotten. The Mahdi army committed many massacres in Baghdad and Samarra. Even imams of the mosque did not escape this ruthless campaign. It was a sectarian campaign that only God saved Iraq from. In my opinion, Dr. Haider Saeed should have mentioned the Badr Brigade, or Badr Corps. It was a political formation formed in Iran, but entered Iraq after the occupation. Now they transform themselves into a political organization, calling themselves the Badr organization, which falls within the theme of this workshop. And also, there's the question of the popular mobilization movement, which was established by the religious reference marja'iyya. This now the popular mobilization force is stronger than the Iraqi army itself, and despite that they affiliate themselves to the commander, the general command, but they act independently. These are very important three papers. I just want to say what Dr. Khalil is saying that, and maybe this interact with Mr. Hamza is saying, and that is part of the strategy of political violence comes within the framework of self-defense, whether we're talking about the individual level or the organizational collective level. This must be clarified further, and how much of this is devoted to from the total political violence effort. And also, if we had a picture of what happened 2008, maybe we could have anticipated what happened in 2011, 2012. Also, how can we distinguish between a nationalist, Salafist, jihadist movement or a global jihadist Salafist movement? Is this linked to their leadership or what? Finally, Dr. Haider, something I did not understand. You said that the political organization of al-Mahdi army became more important. So although there was no political party, it was just a group. So there was an organized, disciplined group called al-Mahdi group. How did this change occur? How did they become a disciplined political party? And this discipline presented by its members in parliament is evident.
Sultan Khalifi, question to Mr. Hamza about Ahrar al-Sham, about the confrontation with Jabhat al-Nusra, during which it was fighting over controlled zones and influence zones. There were some Islamic scholars who were spread north of Syria who intervened every time to organize the Sharia courts and trials, and every time al-Nusra continued to impose its influence and control. So what was Harakat al-Sham role in dissolving these courts, and why didn't they interfere? Thank you. I'm not an academic. I'm from the private sector. I have an investment company. And by my nature, the first question that comes to my mind is that the panelists spoke, and I'm addressing Hamza and Haider. I want to understand, what is the role of money in changing positions? Don't tell me that it's only there were some different interpretation or ideas to change from armed action movement to a political one. I'm sure that's money, and money has pushed them to change not only the field work or national and patriotic work. Do you have any paper that shows how did this leadership interact with sources of investment and money? Dr. Abban, I would like to correct something that was said by Mr. Haider Saeed about the Mahdi army was created to respond to the orders of the religious authorities represented by Sistani. In fact, Sistani confirmed since the beginning that handling of power should be through peaceful ways, and constitutions should be written by the Iraqis. And that's why you find that Sistani did have some differences with Mr. Sadr and obliged him to close his bureaus in Najaf after the military entered into Najaf. Yasser Abu Hilala, two questions. One, the problem of Arab regimes, they are very much backward, except they are, when they confront the opposition, they become very clever and very complicated. Abdurrahman al-Khayat, in his book, Dhikrayat, said that the oppression of the security force in Egypt created extremism and fanaticism, and I think this applies to other countries. There's an important factor that the regime's interest was to militarize the peaceful revolutions. Even the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria are said to have been lured to military action by the regime. Same thing applies to Egypt after Rabaa. in addition to other factors, of course. The other question, this is not only an Islamic issue, even the Marxists, if we organize this conference in Latin America, the same ideas and discussion will take place when State Abu Hamza or Abdullah will be in Sheikh Guevara and Castro, etc. So the approach should be a bit larger and not only restricted to the Islamic circles, as if we are tending to be violent more than other nations. In fact, we do have some cases from Latin America and other countries, and and as you said, there was another case of the region. I'm very sorry, but we don't have time. I know there are so many people who want to ask questions. One last question, but fast. The first remark is that I think this session should have been entitled From Peace to Arms, but it was useful. First thing about Mr. Khalil, he spoke about the fifth conference of the Muslim Brotherhoods and in Egypt by Hassan Banna, but I think he forgot something important and that led to using violence by the Muslim Brotherhood, but that most of the Islamic movements were influenced by Sayyid Qutb, who talked about ignorant societies that led to violence, not only in Egypt, but in different Arab countries also, including for preparing the ground for Daesh and other movements. The other remark is about the Syrian the complicated situation. In fact, the question I have is these movements were reviewed by Mr. Hamzeh. When there were some attempts for some settlements by Russia and other countries, what was their position to change from weapons to peace? Once again, I'm sorry I can't give the floor to all those who raised their hands because we don't have time. Maybe we'll give you time next session. Now we put an end to the session. Dr. Khalil. Thank you. I thank all. I think that to comment on Mr. Rahman, in fact, his remarks are very clever and good ones, and I think we need a conference in the future just about the other face of the coin, from peace to weapons to arms. I think one might understand that the original position of this organization was they wanted arms and not peace. No, but they went to arms only after very complicated situations. As for the other question, Dr. Ahmed Masri, your question about to distinguish between violence and using other means. I think about the Islamic groups. There are two kinds. There are two kinds of groups. So one that use violence as original part of their action, and as they have religious interpretation that legitimizes using violence for them. About all that we've said. What I meant in my paper is that the calls for violence within the Muslim world after 2013 was mostly the preventive violence. Because the regime was very harsh with them, but were afraid, and they were afraid to go out to the streets. So they said we must defend ourselves if we are attacked when we demonstrate in the streets. And this, of course, depends on the personalities of the people. And this is I had many witnesses who said that using violence, there are different kinds of violence, of course. There's the physical violence, and there's moral violence, and there is but in Egypt, nobody they began, first of all, attacking Muslim Brotherhood by demonization of this movement. Mr. Yasser Abu Hilal said a very important thing. I agree with him that we must definitely put an end to the idea that we must showcase that it's the regime who pushed people to violence, because the Egyptian regime is the best example of that allows the Daesh elements to mingle with those in the prisons, while does not allow the prisoners from the Muslim Brotherhood to mingle with the other prisoners. As to another thing about what I meant, that the fifth conference Hassan bin did not call for the violence and theological way. He did speak about Jahiliyyah, but it also comes that we are scholars, not judges, and as if that all violent groups are linked to Muslim Brotherhood movement, but this is not really a scientific way to express things. Thank you. Thank you. I thank all who raised questions. In fact, the issue of the Sadri movement is a very interesting subject for studies. And I know several universities in the world are preparing PhD and master's degrees about this issue, about the militias, about the organization, political organization of the Shiites. And I'll try to answer some of the questions. Mr. Yunus, General Yunus, in fact. Yes, I did, in my paper, I do refer to Saraya Salam, and I did that, and I didn't say that the Sadr cancelled or put an end to all militias. No, I said he weakened them, especially after the fall of Mosul. In fact, the Shiites began to feel that they are facing an existential challenge when facing Daesh. Yes, there are many contradictions in the Sadri movement. I think I've tried to say that the decision taken by the movement is not necessarily linked to the person of Muqtada Sadr. It is linked to different groups or tendencies inside the movement. But it seems he took sides in one of these tendencies, and I wanted to describe at least two of these wings inside the movement. Yes, al-Mahdi army did play a big role in the civil war in 2006-2007, but I also think that it developed later on. Practically, it was the tool of revenge, the Shiite tool of the Sunnis after the explosions of the mosque in Samarra. In fact, I prepared this paper about a year ago, and before Abadi announced the liberation of Mosul and the end of the war against Daesh. But regarding the Hajj al-Sha'bi, the popular mobilization units, these are their terms of reference. Then the religious authorities called these volunteers to join the army, the official institution. there's a tendency within the government or the political Shiite class in Iraq that they cannot secure the country or themselves, and they need non-central institutions to protect themselves. And this began with Maliki government. He began, in fact, in the beginning, a war against the militias. But before that, and the alliance of Shiites, and just 2 months before the fall of Mosul, Maliki said that since 2013 we began to call for groups of jihadists who are non-official, and he used the name the massive mobilization of people's mobilization, and the idea was to organize that. They even draw logo for it, which is very close to Hezbollah's logo. And this was all within the changes of Maliki after the Arab Spring. In the beginning, he had reservations regarding the Iranians, but then he changed completely. I think that Sadri movement has not become a party. I think on May 2009 there was a general conference held in Istanbul, and this question was raised: how to change into a political organization. I pinpointed some structures of the movement. They have something called the Political Bureau. Jaysh al-Mahdi, which is the armed wing of Tayyar Sadr movement. And also, yes, he did use the rental system, having some quotas inside the country and some income. And so after 2009, al-Sadr movement became part of the government, and I said it was created by a number of scholars in Najaf to implement what the Marja'iyya wants or the Sistani wants. In fact, the Sistani is there's a paragraph I did not read. To clarify your question, yes, Sistani did not. I said, but this movement or this does not represent all the Shiites, but Muqtada Sadr is the son of an important Shiite scholar. So we are in agreement. Quickly speaking, and about to answer Dr. Muhammad, I said I described the factions that went to violence and others who did not want to the political track. So the Islamists didn't know what to do. Should they take part in the demonstrations in the streets? And I remember at that time there was a forum allowing them to go into the streets, but not to chant any slogans. Just go along with the people. So using or calling for violence against the regime was religious more than. That's why they followed a good way. And to answer Mr. Yasser's question was important. Yes, the regime did send the Salafists and Jihadists to go, and the Salafists and Jihadists also, and the Salafists in particular, and the Islamists in their discussions were, they know that Ahrar al-Sham was a line between the Salafists and the revolutionaries, in a way that the regime cannot. The same applies to Jabhat al-Nusra. It only joined al-Qaeda in a very late date. And you escape these Islamists had defeated the regime, militarily speaking. But they were defeated by the Russians, not by the regime. And that's why in 2012 the regime stopped releasing the Salafists in the prison. And one of these prominent figures of Salafists was only released in 2015, but in exchange of releasing some prisoners. As for the question, I think the problem of Ahrar al-Sham is that they did not want to review, to send to their supporters their corrections or the reviews they make. So they had the flexibility and at the top, while as their supporters were strict because they were Salafists. And in fact, the Ahrar Sham were protecting al-Raqqa, but there was no decision taken to fight Daesh. That's why the Raqqa fell into the hands of Daesh. And that applies to others. That's why there was this issue of Sharia tribunals. I think I said, in fact, I spoke of if Nazir Hakim said to me in Faylaq Sham, he said, if Nusra decides now in 2016 to attack us, we will continue 14 days. Ahrar Sham will continue 2 days. I said to this Ahrar Sham, and they were so arrogant. They say, okay, let's begin, let battle begin and we'll see. But in fact, it took only half an hour to be beaten. This is so the question is, do their supporters, do they believe in the transformations they had? It was clear that there was a big gap between the leadership and the supporters. And as conflicts inside the movement, there was this tendency of Abu Jabir, who was described as to being an extremist, while in fact wasn't so. And the conflict inside the movement was not about being moderate or extremist. It was about who controls the movement, especially after al-Masri and then Ali Abu Umar, who considered that he moved away these other personalities. That's why they were divided and dissented and created Jaysh al-Ahrar, which is closer to al-Nusra. Thank you very much. I thank all the panelists. We will be back at 1:30. Thank you.